Palestine!
Long live Palestine!
No more nickel, no more dimes, no more money for Israel's crimes!
Not another nickel!
But on the other hand, what we do have is behind the table arming of opposition groups, which Yasser was speaking about, are consistently moving to basically decapacitate the progressive elements of natural grassroots organizing that is happening and has been happening for so long in so many communities, right? So this is sort of a form of neo-imperialism, and our governments are involved in it, right?
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 23 cable stations from Vermont to New York City. On the internet at thestruggle.org. Our YouTube channel with over 1,000 videos is Struggle Video Media. Protests across the world are taking place over the issue of the treatment of Palestinians. Unfortunately, the killings of Palestinians are nothing new, but the savage lynching and burning to death of Mohammed Abu Khader, the beating caught on video of his cousin, has caused an awakening. Then the merciless Israeli bombing of Gaza resulted in worldwide anger. This is video from Hartford, Connecticut. Protest signs call for an end to the billions in yearly U.S. aid to Israel and a boycott of Israeli products. 3 Israelis have been held for weeks for the lynching of Abu Khader. Supposedly they have confessed, but their names haven't even been publicly released. Reportedly, they will plead temporary insanity. That way they can spend a few years in a mental institution and then be released.
When Palestine is under attack, what do? Stand up, fight back!
A week later, on a day of torrential rain, several dozen protesters came together on the same spot in Hartford.
Genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. We want you to know that we have been displaced since 1947. It used to be our land, and now we own nothing of it because of the policies of the Zionist regime back in Israel. We demand the rights to return to our land. We have been refugees for over 60 years now. We want you to hear our message. We have rights that needs to be fulfilled. Free, free Palestine!
This took place after several of us went to the offices of both U.S. senators and presented them with a letter calling for an end to U.S. aid to Israel. The senators ignored the letter but dramatically gave us an answer. They both, and I'm talking about Chris Murphy and Richard Blumenthal, these 2 senators became co-sponsors of a bill blaming all the violence in Palestine-Israel on Hamas and giving the Israeli regime a green light to continue its war crimes. The Israeli army brags about how accurately it uses its American weapons. The shooting dead of the 4 children on the Gaza beach brings up a question. Was it a dreadful mistake, IDF precision, or sport hunting? For decades, the idea that we could question the billions being sent to Israel has been considered a taboo. No more. In view of the horrendous assault on Gaza, it's time to bring up this issue in every demonstration. With water being shut off to thousands in Detroit, with schools being closed down in Chicago and Philly, with the homeless being thrown out of shelters in New Haven, Connecticut, Americans are ready to question whether there should be an unending stream of aid to the Jewish superiority state. The Middle East Crisis Committee, the group which sponsors the struggle, is calling on all the anti-war movements and organizations to join together and declare a day in which there will be national sit-ins at all congressional offices with the demand, cut off all U.S. money to Israel. Now, from early June at the Left Forum, Stefan Christoff talks about how the media talks about Syria. He spoke at a panel called by MENA Solidarity Network US.
I think that the point to begin with is an obvious point, which is that if we look at the mainstream media's portrayal of Syria today, there's a simplistic binary presented which basically illustrates a situation on the ground that is very distant from reality. We see portrayals of a anti-imperialist dictatorship fighting a foreign influence and funded Islamist opposition and armed opposition. And beyond that sort of basic binary, you have some small exceptions of articles or investigations that go beyond that, but generally speaking, this is the way that the Syrian uprising, the Syrian revolution is presented as the Syrian civil war. And I think as progressives, it's very important for us to understand that actually what is happening is an uprising, and there is a revolution going on. Is it complex? Absolutely. But I do think it's important for us to reject a very mainstream binary of Syria that is being imposed on us. And the thing that I'm continually shocked by, surprised, angered, when I consistently hear us as progressives adopting a discourse that is obviously imposed both by the Syrian dictatorship and global imperial powers, so the United States government, the EU, our conservative government in Canada. I think what is happening, and a lot of what Yasser described is really incredible, because we actually see the fulfillment of one of the points that I've heard a couple times coming up at the Left Forum, which is the radical imagination. And this idea that we cannot prescribe sort of fabricated notions of social movements to different contexts, whether it's in our own communities, within our cities, whether it's in our schools, or whether it's internationally, right? And that spirit of the radical imagination is something that is unpredictable and complex. And I also really like one of the terms that was used before, which is anti-imperialism from below. I really thought it was great that these two sessions were happening at the Left Forum, because we are, of course, in a context where you have a lot of excuses being made for the Syrian government by traditional old school Marxist organizations. And it's, Marxist inspired organizations. Now, I'm into a lot of things to do with Marxism, absolutely. I'm also into a lot of things to do with anarchism, but that's sort of not the point. The point is more that if we are progressives, I think we should be recognizing that spirit of the radical imagination and that process of transformative social change that is very real. And to think about it today, sitting in this classroom here in Manhattan, and thinking about the ways that people were organizing that was being described, and the incredible circumstances that this new world, which is being born every day in these liberated areas, to contrast our reality and that one is pretty overwhelming. But I think beyond getting overwhelmed, the point is that as progressives, the question should really be, rejecting the binary that I mentioned, but more importantly, what can we do? I mean, what can we do? What we can do is sort of reject this old school notion of anti-imperialism from above, the anti-imperialist dictatorships, which we know brought no liberation for the people who lived under them. I think that this is an obvious point. We don't need to go into the details and examples across the world. So today, we're talking about media, or I'm supposed to say a few things about media. The person that, of course, comes to mind when I think about media is a friend of some of ours named Ali Mustafa, who is from Toronto, and who a lot of us worked with over the years, and who lost his life in Syria, in Aleppo. And Ali was killed by a bomb, a barrel bomb from the Syrian dictatorship, the Syrian military, in a liberated area in Aleppo. But I think if we're thinking about journalism and people's journalism, which totally rejects the confines of media makers as understood to be sort of objective, non-biased bodies that essentially sit on the fence, which essentially means siding with power. Ali, who was on the ground, was somebody who actually exemplified that idea that as media makers, we're also active people who have dreams, and we also have our ideas, our spirits. And Ali, on the ground, decided to do solidarity work, not just take photos. So the reason I mention Ali, which I really encourage everybody to check out his work, I'm sure a lot of you have, is because I think in terms of understanding the problematics of the way the mainstream media is projecting and somewhat successfully forcing a notion of what's happening in Syria that is totally ridiculous. I had a chance to speak with him before he passed away, and I just wanted to say, share a few things that Ali said in one of our conversations. He said, I originally went to Syria as a natural extension of my previous work in the region, having traveled to Palestine and then Egypt. After following the war in Syria very closely for a few years, I felt it was important to go there and cover the war firsthand. I could not ignore this ongoing human tragedy. Beyond the statistics, I felt that Western mainstream media coverage of Syria leaves a lot to be desired. It's important for journalists coming from a critical perspective to be in places like Syria to report in a more nuanced, informed, and contextualized way. The only way I could truly get a sense of the reality on the ground was to go there and figure it out for myself. And Ali went there and lost his life. I think that in terms of thinking about that memory, we should also note that, Ali is one of so many countless thousands in Syria who have lost their lives. But I think for me, really portrayed the spirit of the revolution that is taking place, and he lived the revolution. And I think for us to remember people who have fallen, people who have died in these contexts, in these struggles, somebody like Ali illustrates the ridiculousness of the way that Syria is consistently portrayed to us, which totally marginalizes a lot of what Yasser was describing in terms of the actual organizing on the ground. So the other thing the few other points I wanted to illustrate is that, as was mentioned before, there's incredible popular organizing going on the ground in the liberated areas. We often think about territory and space in terms of how we organize, right? Like, how do we express our ideals of another world, right? Another world is possible. I think in terms of the spirit of internationalism, we can't look at Syria as some far away place that is totally removed from the organizing that's happening here in North America. Obviously, a lot of people here don't see it that way, but consistently in terms of rhetoric and language within the left, you sort of do see this othering of the Syrian struggle, right? And I think that's very important to address. For example, one thing that I was thinking about in a panel earlier was that, you know, in terms of the cultural parameters of how we understand the Syrian uprising, right? If we're looking at the way that Syrians are expressing their resistance to oppression, right? You'll see phrases, songs, slogans, painting that references Islamic culture. This is something that is obviously a part of the society. But consistently, one thing that I just wanted to note, and this is a totally obvious point for some people in the room, but I think is a point that I consistently see being missed by a lot of progressives, which is an obvious point, but I want to say it, which is that there's consistently this othering of struggles where we see Islamic culture being expressed. For example, we talk about the problematics of like Islamic influence in the resistance movements. Do we ever challenge the fact that the Zapatistas organize in churches? Do we ever think about the fact that the first encuentros in Chiapas, like a huge mobilizing part, not entirely, they're not a religious movement, but I'm saying if we're thinking back to Central America and the FMLN, the Sandinistas, I think anybody here who's familiar with this history would recognize that liberation theology and churches as social spaces played a very important role in shaping the capacity for mobilization and also the cultural framework in which those struggles were articulated, right? So why is it consistently a problem when we see struggles happening in a context, you know, I think you get my point. So that's you know, something we need to reject, and I think that's very important. Why are we trying to impose, you know, a sort of a cultural and religious framework for which Syrians should fight their struggle? And that's consistently, I'm not, people aren't saying it like that, but a lot of comments are framed in that way. Okay, so in terms of a few other things, I think that like one of the other points I wanted to mention is the challenges that we face as progressives here, which is that we have governments in Canada and the United States that are denouncing the Syrian regime, speaking about helping Syrian refugees, and basically doing nothing. That's essentially, I think, you know, a fair summary of the situation. Doing nothing in terms of supporting Syrians who are involved in a liberation struggle. But on the other hand, what we do have is behind the table arming of opposition groups, which Yasser was speaking about, are consistently moving to basically decapacitate the progressive elements of natural grassroots organizing that is happening and has been happening for so long in so many communities, right? So this is sort of a form of neo-imperialism, and our governments are involved in it, right? So I think that that is also another thing we need to challenge. We need to challenge the way that the left is framing the conflict, and the way that the left consistently delegitimizes the Syrian revolution, but we also need to criticize the ways in which our governments are playing games, straight up. And that's very, very important to mention, and it's very, very important for us to address. Now, we, as you know, people involved in social movements, are relatively powerless, let's be honest, in terms of, you know, state power in the world. But the last thing I wanted to say is that I don't think that means we shouldn't try to do things, right? And I admire a lot of the work that Yasser has been working on, and others who've been involved in these two sessions have been really pushing the last few years, because it really, you know, and also the work that Ali Mustafa was doing in Syria. which really brings forward this idea of the possibility of the people's diplomacy, or, you know, sort of like anti-imperialism from below. But what I mean by the people's diplomacy is that, you know, if we're thinking about possibilities for liberation, why do we consistently frame our international solidarity in terms of the powers and the regulations and the frameworks of nation states, in terms of the United Nations, in terms of our governments, right? The success, for example, if we want to just shift for a second to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, has nothing to do with governments, has everything to do with people organizing. You know, the international solidarity on all sorts of struggles has everything to do with popular organizing. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that there's so much possibility for us to organize in a way that is critical of the things I mentioned before, within the left, towards our governments, but that builds human grassroots relationships. And I think that's really what you could say anti-imperialism from below, or the people's diplomacy, is about. And that is really rooted in the notion of things like the commons and liberation and our own spaces. You know, that's this whole thing that we are in New York City. So, you know, many of the ideas of the Occupy movement. Now, our struggles are global, right? Our struggles are global, and the odds are overwhelming. However, let's recognize struggles where they are taking place, and let us try to find ways to forge alliances, because what's happening obviously on the ground, and whether it's, for example, like grassroots organic agriculture that's happening in a lot of villages in the north, close to the Turkish border, that is outside of the infrastructure of the state, whether it's popular demonstrations that happen in the liberated areas where people are demonstrating, from what I understand, I haven't been in these spaces, but from what I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, almost once a week in some cities, people are demonstrating. In the cities especially where you have a huge influence of Gulf-funded American armed Islamic factions, Islamist factions, you have people demonstrating not just against the Assad regime, but what I can read of those demonstrations is basically people are asserting grassroots power. They're like, well, we're not armed like the militias or like the armed organizations, but we have power, right? So whether it's those demonstrations happening at a grassroots level, so we could say from here, those demonstrations are meaningless, right? We could say, well, they're not fighting the government direct arm to arm, machine gun to machine gun, Kalashnikov to Kalashnikov. However, people could say the same thing about us. Does it mean that we shouldn't support them, right? We're just demonstrating. You know, I really liked one thing that was said on the panel before, which was this idea that I consistently hear it in this forum and many others. People are so hypercritical of the Syrian opposition and the Syrian revolution, the Syrian revolt, and within the left, and like super judgmental in a way that is really gross. I'm sorry to use like a ridiculous term, but what I mean by that is like, you know, like the notion of solidarity is like something that is steadfast, and it's like should be at the rock of everything that we're doing. That's without it, we're nothing, right? Of course, being critical that's one thing, but like it's obvious what's happening if you do any research. We all have access to the internet, or basically everybody, you know, within this forum definitely has access to the internet to research that there is a popular uprising going on, and so the people consistently ridiculing that is something that we got to throw out the window. And so the last thing I would say is that so yeah, I mean, it's complex. As I said, you know, it's I hope that I brought a few things to the table. I think it's looking at this in an internationalist perspective is very important. Rejecting the sort of the colonial racist frameworks in which some of the left is looking at the Syrian uprising has to be rejected. But the most important thing, you know, is that we have to support grassroots initiatives. The last thing I would say here is it's a short statement that was put forward by a solidarity group that I'm part of in Montreal called Tadamun, which means solidarity in Arabic. And it says, the regime has been dealing with the revolutionary movement by sheer repression and force. The result has been heavy civilian casualties, destructions of homes and civilian infrastructure, mass displacement of population, and in some areas dire humanitarian consequences, lack of food, no electricity, water shortages, a framework shaped by war crimes. Yet it's possible and valid to draw from this context that Syrians throughout Syria from all economic classes belonging to all social and cultural groups have recognized Assad's rule for what it is: authoritarian, arbitrary, violent, and divisive, and are collectively saying no more. We don't want a government that robs us of our dignity and freedom. We want the downfall of the regime. Simply put, this demand for revolutionary change is deserving of our support. That's it. Thank you, Stefan.
One bit of good news. Amr Jabran's family has been allowed to meet with him in a Jordanian prison. He's apparently in decent health. There has been no charges filed against him, and his family has not been told why he has been arrested. The United States gives over $600 million a year to the Jordanian monarchy. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.